I'm very excited to introduce to all of you and to the folks at home. Hello, folks at home. We're recording for our YouTube channel. Very excited to introduce Heath Fogg Davis. Heath is a professor of political science at Temple University in Philadelphia, where he teaches courses on anti-discrimination law, democratic political theory, and the politics of race, gender, and sexuality. He's also an activist and advocate for marginalized communities, including transgender and gender nonconforming people, women, people of color, LGBTQ people, and low-income people. Towards that end, he serves on the City of Philadelphia's Mayor's Commission on LGBT Affairs. In his latest book that we're here to discuss, Beyond Trans, Does Gender Matter?, he outlines practical strategies to help organizations of all different kinds to implement gender policies that are both trans-inclusive and institutionally smart. The book is already garnering widespread praise. One of my favorite lines that I found from one of the reviews comes from Pop Matters, where they wrote, "Beyond Trans is as much a call to remediate harm done to trans, intersex, and gender nonconforming individuals as it is a plea for good reasoning. Reading Beyond Trans is like having one's window shades thrown open after a long night of sleep. The sunlight burns the eyes, but it awakens them." And the Washington Post named it to their summer 2017 summer reading list. Tonight, we're also excited to have Shannon Minter, the legal director for the National Center for Lesbian Rights, who is going to be in conversation with Heath. So without further ado, please help me in welcoming them to Politics and Prose.
Great. Thanks, everybody. Well, it's very exciting to be here in this venue. Politics and Prose has been so supportive of the LGBT community, and I am just thrilled to be here with my friend and colleague, Heath Fogg Davis, who has written a really important work. I mean, there's so much going on right now. It's like a really exciting time in the worlds of transgender advocacy and transgender theory. But Heath, you know, what makes your book unique and such an important contribution is your ability to really straddle the two worlds of policy and advocacy on the one hand and theory on the other. I mean, and that is really unique. I just can't think of another book in this field that has done that so successfully. I know probably some people have seen the that satirical Onion article headline that's floating around the internet right now about Trump voter feels betrayed by the president after reading 800 pages of queer feminist theory. Well, you know, it's a little harsh, but there is a point to that. And I just say a lot of writing about transgender issues and people does start off with a kind of grand theory about sex or gender and then just rides that hobby horse, you know, right to the bitter end. And what I love so much about your work is that you do just the opposite. You know, you really are starting by looking at the real world struggles and issues that transgender people have, and you, at every turn, you're acknowledging the complexity and the messiness and the intersectionality of gender. And I love that you're looking at very specific contexts with ID documents, bathrooms, women's sports, women's colleges, and then in all those arenas, you're asking the question, do we need continued gender segregation? And if so, why? And what kind of policies would really answer the specific purposes that are legitimate in those contexts? And I just also really appreciate that you're always looking for proposals that help not just transgender people, but that would actually be helpful for everyone, and just as importantly, cause no harm to anyone. So it's just such a refreshing and rich and productive and much needed kind of approach to these issues. So really thank you for writing this book, and tell us what prompted you to undertake this project.
Okay, sure. So thank you, Shannon, for being here, and we've been friends for a while. We've not had a conversation in front of an audience before, so this will be interesting. Thank you, everybody, for coming tonight. So as Shannon was pointing out, the book is really about the human stories behind the policies that affect not just trans people, but gender nonconforming individuals and good old-fashioned sexism as well. So the story that inspired me to write the book, so I live in Philadelphia, and I don't know if people in DC heard about this story, but there was a transgender woman, African-American transgender woman, Charlene Arcilla, who in Philadelphia, we had a very bizarre policy with our public transportation. If you bought a monthly pass, you had to have a sex marker on your monthly pass. It was a strange policy to have in place. Interestingly enough, when I did the research, it turned out that a lot of American cities did this at one point in history, but most cities had moved away from it. SEPTA, which is the public transit authority in Philly, defended itself by saying that this was a fraud prevention measure, and it was a very sort of it went down a heterosexist kind of explanatory road where they said husbands and wives are going to get one pass and swap it back and forth, and we have a legitimate business interest in preventing that. In any event, so Charlene Arcilla purchased an F-marked pass, and she tried to board a bus with the pass and was told by the bus driver that she couldn't use the pass. And I'm just going to read. I wanted to bring Charlene's voice into our discussion tonight. So Charlene had been an activist in Philadelphia for many years, both around trans issues and also HIV/AIDS activism, and sadly passed away 2 years ago. But here are her words describing, this is from an excellent documentary film that talks about the SEPTA case. The driver was like, "You cannot use this pass." After I had swiped it and I was walking to my seat, he called me back to the front and I said, "Well, why can't I?" He said, "Well, because you're not a female." And I was like, "Well, I'm a transsexual." And he's like, "What's that?" And I'm like, "Okay, I do not feel like educating this man today." I just want to get to my destination, so I pulled out $2 and I put the $2 into the meter. So I just wanted to share that because it gives you the context in which this happened. If you're not directly affected by this, it could just seem like a trivial thing. Well, what's the big deal? Gender markers on a bus pass, whatever, use a different pass. Interestingly enough, she went back to try to use an M-marked bus pass, and she was turned away by a bus driver who said, you're not a man. So I start with this story because it's the genesis of the argument for the book, and it just goes into so many different other case studies. So here we see where she was put in a no-win situation. The civil rights violation of not being able to use a public accommodation that she had paid for was clear. So she filed a legal complaint with the city of Philadelphia against SEPTA. So we have gender identity as a protected category in Philadelphia, as do a lot of cities. We don't have it at the federal level and so on, but in a lot of localities we do. SEPTA, long story short, SEPTA dragged its heels for a long time. Eventually it abandoned the sex stickers, but it never admitted that it had violated anybody's civil rights, of course. It was just in a sort of a memo, buried in a memo about fare hike increases, that they would no longer be using the gender markers. I start with this story because if the gender markers don't make sense in this situation, clearly it has nothing to do with whether somebody should be able to board a bus. We can all see that. So what about our driver's licenses? What about our birth certificates? What about our passports? What about bathrooms? What about sports? It just made me think about all these other venues where at least we need to ask the question. And I think that's the essence really here. And I think the radical essence of Charlene's story is that it couldn't be fixed by just saying, well, let's assimilate you into one of the binary categories, because she wasn't believed. She clearly said, I'm a woman, and wasn't believed in that situation. And we have that scenario happen whenever we transfer the authority to somebody else, whether it's a restaurant manager or a bus driver, to judge us based on whether they think that we meet their standard of a real woman or a real man. So.
Yeah, it's such a powerful story, and one of the things you point out in the book is that it's no accident that Charlene was a woman of color, and that these gender classifications the negative impact of them falls on transgender people certainly, but on a much broader range of gender non-conforming people, and that those burdens fall most harshly on people of color, who are so much more likely to be questioned and interrogated and viewed with suspicion and harassed. I think that's a really important theme that emerges throughout the book. And another thing which you just hit on is the one I wanted to ask you about. and that is you talk a lot about the insufficiency in many contexts of what has really been the dominant approach of the mainstream transgender rights movement, which I've been up to my eyeballs in. So I'm certainly guilty of this, of just sort of accepting the framework that we're going to have government ID that's gender segregated. We're going to have an MRF, and our goal really as a movement, the legal movement, has been to just make it easier for transgender people to change the gender marker on their driver's license, birth certificates, passports. And I've certainly benefited from that personally. I think you have too. Yeah, and yet you make a really compelling case for why that is ultimately probably not a sufficient approach.
Yeah, and it kind of goes back to Charlene's story about why that doesn't work. The dominant approach, and I want to be clear too, that I totally get the pragmatic, the strategic value, and I've benefited from those assimilationist kind of strategies, and a lot of people have. But as I was writing the book and doing the research and talking to people in the community, it's clear that I am in somewhat of a position of privilege with respect to the trans community, economic privilege, and also gender-based privilege. So things look very different for a lot of trans women. And if you bring race into the picture, things get even more complicated and in a lot of cases a lot more dire. So basically, the basic point is that not everybody can or wants to assimilate into the binary. And I think that that's always going to be the case. Whenever you have the sex binary in a policy governing anything in the public sphere, then you have to make decisions about who's included and who's excluded from those categories. And that story about Charlene basically saying, here's my pass, I bought a pass that represents who I am gender-wise, and it being rejected. I should say also with that story, it's important to point out that in a lot of cases, she didn't get hassled by bus drivers, so there's a sort of this haphazard kind of random terroristic kind of quality to this about never knowing when, if this would be a good day or a really bad day, and nobody should have to be thinking about that when they're trying to access basic things like public restrooms and a bus. So I think the assimilation, it gets us part of the way, and it's been beneficial for sure. But then I think the next step is to really think about. And it sounds like a really radical thing to say, let's get rid of gender everywhere, and that's actually not what I'm saying in the book. But I'm saying ask the question in specific venues. So gender might make sense to a lot of us or be important as a personally and even socially, and I think it is. But when it comes to public policies, we should be very careful about when and where we write it into a law or a policy.
Right, it's the legally defined and imposed gender classifications that you're questioning. So another place this comes up, obviously, is bathrooms, and you can't miss this issue in the press and the headlines every day. In North Carolina, passed a law last year that requires transgender people to use restrooms that correspond to their birth certificates, and even as we're sitting here, Texas may very well pass a similar law. I hope that it does not. They've called a special session just in order to consider a law similar to North Carolina's. There's a lot of litigation around transgender students and restrooms. Talk to us about what you think is the appropriate approach there, because again, the mainstream transgender rights movement, our approach has been pretty much 100% to take the position that we're not challenging the existence of separate restrooms for men and women. We're just saying a transgender man should be able to use the men's room, transgender woman should be able to use the women's room. Even that has felt like a pretty tough battle, but you're somewhat critical of that approach.
Yeah, and I think, if you think about the North Carolina law, and you just start to deconstruct its logic, it's completely illogical on so many dimensions. So North Carolina is a state where you can actually change the gender marker on your birth certificate. So the sort of, what the state legislature was trying to do by pointing to birth certificates was to try to find something that is sort of the original, real statement about who you are, male or female, And we know that, I mean, people who are born with intersex conditions, that complicates the situation. And just the fact that I think in every state except for Tennessee, you can change the gender marker on your birth certificate. So that even falls. It doesn't accomplish the trans discrimination or exclusion that it actually sets out to do. But of course, what it set out to do really was to scare people and to make it seem like, I mean, and it sends a very clear, terrible message. But logistically, there would have to be some kind of like a bathroom bouncer outside of every bathroom checking your birth certificate, which
who
is
carries your birth certificate
nobody
around?
carries their birth certificate with them. We don't do that. So it just falls apart on so many dimensions, but the symbolic power was incredibly powerful, so much so that Texas and other states are considering similar things. And it's not, a lot of this is not based on reasoning, all right? So trying to sort of, in the book, bring things down to a level where at least we can have a conversation about and ask the question about the relevance. In the bathroom situation, I think it's an architectural problem, and I think that we could design bathrooms in the public sphere much more better. We have some examples, and I talk about this in the book, especially in Philadelphia and Manhattan, and where restaurants are pressed for space. In a lot of cases, it's not been like a trans-inclusive, innovation. But what they've done is they've built individual toilet stalls with ceiling-to-floor partitions, so you have your individual privacy. And when you talk to people about their main concern about the bathroom issue, it's always about privacy and safety. And it's very gendered, about sort of this, narrative of protecting our daughters and our women. So I think you can solve that situation, the problem, by building privacy and the individual stalls. I'm going to be controversial here and say we should just get rid of urinals altogether. It's not going to be an easy thing, but I think that that's a convenience. Not all men can use urinals either. And then you have a space in the middle where you have sinks and mirrors where there's no need to gender segregate that. And what's happened in a lot of the venues where this has been employed is that a lot of people don't even realize what's happening, and it's a perfectly fine experience. It's a gender-neutral kind of experience, but they get their privacy. I think that there's also more safety to be had in a situation where you don't just have girls and women in a secluded place. I mean, that's part of why assaults happen in these venues. And I've been doing a lot of interviews we were talking earlier with radio and stuff, different parts of the country, and everybody always comes back to that issue about sort of like, what about the sex predator who wants to dress up as a woman and go in and do. That's never happened, so we sort of try to get it on that level. But also just that we could build things to be a lot safer than we do right now. So I see it as an architectural solution. We talked earlier about there's a lot of cultural pushback, though, as well. Yeah.
There is, but one of the most compelling things to me in your book is you point out that having different restroom arrangements along the lines of what you're talking about would be so beneficial, not just for transgender people or gender nonconforming people, but for a lot of other folks. I think you should say a little bit about that.
Yeah, absolutely. So getting back to good old-fashioned sexism about just sex-based disadvantage. So the way that we construct bathrooms right now in the public sphere creates a lot of disparity, and we've talked about this before. So I transitioned at 38. I'm 46 now, so I had many years of dealing with the disparity and the time that you have to wait in the lines when there's a crowded venue. So that's an architectural issue as well. Also, the fact that I was gender nonconforming, and we didn't have that term when I was growing up, but that's what I would have been called, I suppose, or more androgynous at different points in my life, and got hassled constantly when trying to use women's bathrooms. So that's a whole dimension of this story about the transgender bathroom issue, that a lot of the people that are affected most consistently on a day-to-day basis are masculine presenting women and girls who get questioned. And I talk about a case in the book where a security guard or a bouncer in a bar actually came into the women's room and banged on the door and told Khadija Farmer, a black masculine presenting lesbian, that she had to get out because there had been a report of a man in the bathroom. And even in that case, which I think is really, really important. She had her New York State ID card, which had an F marker on it. And because this happened so frequently, she was prepared, and she said, "Here's my ID." And the bouncer literally said, "That's neither here nor there. I'm not interested. You need to get out." So that's another situation where the emotional part of this, right, the prejudice just overrides the logic. So even though she had the right ID, and that should have been an easy kind of transaction, it turned out to be horrendous, and it was a lawsuit that restaurant settled out of court.
Yeah, I really relate to that part of your book because I also transitioned in my mid-30s and had my worst experiences ever, far worse. I've never had a problem as a transgender man, but being a gender nonconforming woman and trying to use women's restrooms is a nightmare, and we know that, and all the research, supports that is the group. Masculine-appearing women are the group that are most adversely affected in restrooms. So changing these our automatic acceptance of gender segregated restrooms really would be such a benefit to so many women, and also, as you pointed out, like single parents with children of the other gender and people with disabilities and all that. So I just want to ask you one more question, and then we're going to open it up so you guys get your questions ready to go. Sorry about that. That's bad.
You all as a gender neutral.
Exactly. Exactly. So your book there's so many things I love about this book. It's just so refreshing in so many ways, but a lot of discussion of the advocacy around transgender rights focuses on court cases or legislation, but as you point out in your book, probably the most powerful, certainly one of the most powerful tools for change is just sitting down with schools or employers or social service agencies and talking with people and getting them to voluntarily change their policies just because it makes sense to do that. And so, Heath's book, so much of it is about not just the what kind of policies we should be pushing for, but how we should be doing that work. And it's just so creative. So and I know you do a lot of consulting about that, right? Like, that's in addition to being a professor, you have a whole nother life as like a gender consultant. So yeah, tell us, what do you do when you're talking with folks like that? And I don't know, maybe there's you have a particularly interesting client or something you want to tell us about?
Yeah, well, it has been really interesting, and I have an appendix in the book where I call it a gender audit. And basically, this is what I do with different organizations, and I've worked with big investment, banks to small social service providers, and always asking the same question. Let's go through your administrative policies, whether it's an employee handbook or something like that, and look at where and when you invoke gender and how you do it. And the first question is very basic. Do you need to invoke gender in that instance? In some cases, you can just obliterate it altogether. Like, for example, I went through an employee handbook where they kept talking, his or her in terms of the pronouns, and you could just say the employee. It made a lot more sense to do that. A dress code, for example, there's no need. You would think that there's a need to sort of gender segregate there, but I worked with a company where we just figured out a solution where you say the professional standard, and here are examples of what that different articles of clothing without assigning a gender to it. So it's not about women should wear skirts or pants and stuff like that, but just about here's an array of different choices and stuff like that. So yeah, just sitting down with people, talking to them about it. What's been the most rewarding is to see people sort of like the light bulbs go on and think about things that they could actually just do when they go to work, on Monday morning. Like one person, I did a workshop where the person just said, I'm thinking about the magazines that we have in the waiting room, and I want to take a look at those. So just it's like small things that can make a big difference, all the way up to like big HR health benefit stuff, which is more complicated. But the conversation can start at a very sort of like a basic level. So,
yeah, I've learned so much from your book, and I love you have this wonderful kind of gentle, reasonable style. I'm like, I'm going to try that instead of my usual like confrontational lawyer style. Anyway, I know we'd love to open it up for people's comments or questions. It's your chance to ask Heath whatever you want to know about.
Don't be shy.
Don't be shy, please.
Just don't forget to step up to one of the two microphones up here. Thank you.
guess I have so many different questions on different aspects, but just going back to a more abstract theoretical level, is there any front in which you see that trans rights or a more liberalizing, all-inclusive policy may conflict with more feminist issues, and how can that be negotiated without either side getting angry at the other? Because it doesn't always go together so perfectly. For example, women's colleges are, there aren't very many. Should they just disappear? And should there be no women's sports teams? I mean, those are quite different than the kinds of categories that you invoked. And so, isn't it possible to have a nuanced approach?
Yes, it is. Thank you so much for that question. So, in the book, the chapters are kind of ordered in the order of difficulty that I see with them. And so I start with the identification documents because I think they're not relevant. They're not a good way of tracking our personal identity. All the way, and then I go to restrooms, then I go to single-sex colleges, and then I end with sports because I think that's the toughest case. And so, so I do think some nuance is needed. So asking the question can sometimes yield the answer that yes, it does matter here. And then the next question, I think, is then how? Why and how? And so when I talk about women's colleges, which I'm a big fan of them as institutions and the historical importance of them, but I also talk about the fact that they've been challenged, their admissions policies, specifically by a lot of transgender women, and also for people who entered identifying as female and maybe transitioned to male during their time there. So those are the two things that have really stretched them. And it's been back and forth over time, but most of those places, and really it's the elite women's colleges that have been dealing with this the most, so Barnard and Mount Holyoke and Smith and Bryn Mawr, yep, all of those schools. And there's like 43 or 46 private women's colleges. There's a lot actually throughout the country. They're not all, right, but those are the ones that have been the focus. And incidentally, there are only 3 private men's colleges, which I thought was really interesting. And on their websites, their mission statements say nothing about the purported value of being in an all-male environment. It's very, it's interesting, but that's really the focus of the women's colleges. So most of these schools have eventually adjusted their admissions policies to say that we invite, transgender women, include them in the category of women. Mount Holyoke has gone the farthest, so the only category that can't apply to Mount Holyoke are people who were assigned male at birth and also identify as male at the time of application, which is really interesting when you think about it. I get it. I understand the concerns. However, just from a civil rights perspective, I don't think that you can actually go all the way to that point and then say that this group shouldn't be allowed to apply. It's interesting. I make the argument in the book that I think that some people in that category could probably benefit from being in an environment like some of these schools are, where the emphasis, so my argument is that they maintain their feminist mission and their historical mission of providing like a majority female context where there are a lot of leadership opportunities. There's different classroom dynamics. I teach at a college, so I understand how gender affects classroom dynamics and participation rates and all of that. So I propose at least that maybe it's time to refer to these colleges as historically women's colleges in the same way that we talk about historically black colleges and universities. So historically, HBCUs can't exclude non-black students, right? But there's a historical mission that is perpetuated. So it's complicated, yeah. But I think that's what I would argue in that case. So, yeah.
Hi. I agree that it makes sense to have more gender-neutral bathrooms, and I actually also think that in schools given that there's so much bullying in bathrooms, regardless of gender identity, they ought to have monitors. They ought to have people actually guarding the bathrooms. But the question I have is, and I haven't read the book, what your view is about locker rooms, because it would seem like it's more than just bigotry that women and women maybe who have or people who have daughters may feel. I mean, to be sort of graphic, I mean they don't want their little girls to have to see penises, and I'm not suggesting that somebody who's trans is going to do something inappropriate, but people get undressed in locker rooms, and so I'd be curious to know what you're. But I also think that issue then maybe kind of highlights so many of the other issues for people who. But I don't think necessarily just for people who are bigoted or who are against it, but I think that it's something maybe to actually think about intelligently.
Absolutely. Yeah, thank you for that question. And I think, the restroom issue then kind of leads into the locker room issue, and the showers and stuff like that. I tend to think that these are also architectural problems as well. The idea that you have this open shower where everybody, most gyms, my gym, I know, that you have an individual stall now that you can take a shower in with a curtain, so there's privacy. It's true that we still get undressed in a common area, but I think that you could build privacy into those situations, and in a lot of European countries, they've been doing this for a long time. I will just say, connected to your question, so I was interviewed by Tristan Taramino for Sex Out Loud, and it was a really interesting interview, and at the end of it, she asked me the most challenging question that I've gotten so far, which is about a Korean spa that she goes to, and I think in San Francisco or LA, an all-women's, a female spa, and she went there with a friend whose girlfriend is a trans woman, and the thing here is that people are walking around naked, so bodies are exposed, and the manager told them that this was not okay. So she posed this question to me, and I kind of stumbled around a lot, and I ended up asking her, like, what do you think is the right answer here? And she said, I think this is a good response, that the spa should have been very upfront about its policy, just about gender and nudity, and so if the policy is that we're open to anyone who's female identified, regardless of what their bodies appear like to other people, then that should just be something that is like, bam, you understand that going into that environment, so that there's no surprise. And then but
why isn't it okay for the women who are not trans to feel that? What about their sensibilities? Why is it only the sensibilities on one side?
Yeah.
I mean, are you saying that it's? And I'm not answering the question by asking it.
Yeah.
Is it just ignored, or are those people just bigoted? Are they not allowed to be in an environment where it's only bodies that are traditionally female that are allowed?
Yeah, I think that there could be different spas, right, with different policies. So, and your question kind of makes me think of another venue that's sort of connected here, like lesbian softball leagues. I played on these when I was back in the day. Social situation where it's all women. I think that there are social reasons for gender segregation sometimes. That's different from a public accommodation. So once you open say you have a business and you're opening your doors to the public, then that's a different situation. But there could be a variety of different, a private spa, right, that had a policy that was different than that. So, I think just about articulating the policy is important so that people understand.
Can I jump in just because I think, well, no, this is and thank you for that question. I mean, so you've identified the hardest possible case, the sort of the Korean spa where there's not very many venues that are like that. And you initially were asking about schools, I think more like school locker rooms. And I think the principle in your book that I think is so important and powerful, that we should look for solutions that benefit everyone and that don't hurt anyone. And in a school locker room, and we've seen this because there's like literally thousands of schools that have inclusive policies and do let transgender kids use the locker room based on their gender identity. You can just take very modest little steps to create increased privacy for everybody, and that benefits all the students. It's just purely beneficial to everybody. It doesn't hurt anyone. There haven't been any negative incidents or anything like that. So I think usually this is an issue that we can deal with. There may be, there are some really, hard cases like the spa case, but that doesn't, and I don't know the answer there, but I think what you suggested is good. But I just wanted to point out, mostly it's not going to be that difficult to navigate that. And just real quick, since I am a lawyer, the U.S. Supreme Court, when they dealt with whether Virginia Military Institute had to let women into that school, and the school argued, oh no, privacy issues, like we can't have men and women, because a lot of our programs involve people, being together, disrobed, and all that kind of thing. And the Supreme Court said, no, just that you might have to take some steps to create some additional privacy, but that doesn't override the equality concern. So I think that's kind of just a helpful framework too.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for asking that question.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Thank you, Heath and Shannon. I have about 40 things I would like to say about this, so I'm going to narrow it down to 3, I think. The thing I would add to the very thoughtful way that you replied to that concern, and I think we do have to focus on answers that work for everybody, but we also have to look at valuing all people as the highest goal. And there were people who didn't want to drink out of water fountains or sit at lunch counters with black people. At the time, that was a perfectly understandable concern. Now, in general, that sort of thinking is frowned upon. I think we'll get there. I'm not saying how long, but I do think that we'll get there. I work against gender-based violence as my full-time gig, and I know that 90% of all sexual assaults are committed by someone the target knows. I'm not worried about bathrooms. I'm worried about my gender nonconforming friends being policed in bathrooms. I'm not worried about assaults happening in bathrooms. That's not where they happen. I just want to say 2 other quick things. One thing that just has me completely enraged every time I think about it, and I hadn't thought about it in a long time before I came here tonight, is that I've only ever been to the high school graduation of one school system around here, and that's Prince George's County, so I don't know what other counties do it, but the girls and the boys wear different colored robes and sit on opposite sides of the aisles. For no reason. You don't graduate high school with your penis or your vagina or whatever else you've got, right? And it makes absolutely no sense, but it's one other way of imposing gender. Like there are girls' brains and boys' brains or something like that. Drives me crazy. So anybody got kids in a school system around here, please rant at the superintendent. And the other thing I wanted to talk about is something that you brought up at the very beginning, which is kind of, the radical approach versus the assimilationist approach. And every time you touched on that, the dynamic was exactly the same as the marriage struggle. Okay? Do we need to be spending the movement's money and resources getting into this institution, which is by design oppresses women? Or do we spend our money and our brain power and our other resources, figuring out the functions of marriage in our society and taking the ones that we want. And when you were talking about, like gender matters in terms of social gatherings and things like that, lesbian softball teams. I'm a femme, so I was never on the softball teams, but I always had butches, butches on the softball teams. Like there are things like that, but it's like we don't need the ID to say male or female. We don't need the bus pass to say male or female. We don't need the most of the benefits of marriage to come in the package of marriage, right? They can come another way if they are, for example, a dependent spouse getting Social Security, or a dependent family member getting Social Security. So I think a lot of the dynamics are the same, and the movement didn't make the decision that I wish it had made around that. But I think we have an opportunity here.
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah, and just your comment made me think. I mean, the graduation. That's. But I wonder too. I mean, I'm the parent of a 2-year-old and soon to have another kid also. But it's amazing. I mean, it starts now with like the ultrasound technology about learning the sex of the baby, and everybody, complete strangers coming up to my wife and asking that question, what are you having? I mean, that's like just like how are you kind of thing. So, and then, there are these gender reveal cakes now that people do often, where it's like, they have a party and then they cut into the cake, and if it's pink, it's a girl, and if it's blue, it's a boy, and all this stuff. So it's a powerful thing, and I don't think that this book is gonna like combat all of that. And in a sense, there may not be any way to get around the fact that when we meet another person, the first thing that we often take in about them is whether they appear to be male or female. But I hope that then the next question is sort of like, then how relevant is that? And maybe I don't know, or I can't figure it out. And is that relevant to this interaction? You think about like customer service, for example, like sir and ma'am. To me, I want to get rid of those honorifics altogether, ladies and gentlemen, because it sets up people. Like, why set up a server in a restaurant or a customer agent on a telephone to make a mistake? Because they will inevitably make a gender mistake. They will encounter somebody and they will guess and they will get it wrong, and they will end up doing the precise thing that they were trying not to do, which is to offend somebody. They wanted to treat them with respect. So I think like little things like that are things that we can fix, and those are some of the small fixes that people can do in their individual like work settings, even about how they sort of interact with other people. So it's not about getting rid of gender, but about assessing the relevance of it in this particular situation. Do I need to ask the question to the person who appears to be pregnant? Or can I, if I'm trying to be nice and polite, can I maybe say something else other than what are you having?
Yeah, I just will say again, I think part of the power of your book is that you acknowledge the importance of gender to people on a personal level, on a social level. The example about the historic women's colleges and the need to maintain that in some form would be a great example of that. And that doesn't mean that we can't at the same time very vigorously question and eliminate where we can legally imposed gender classifications and gender segregation that just harms everyone. But you're kind of theoretical. You're very sophisticated theoretically, but your theoretical humility in the face of the actual embodied, complicated experience of gender in the real world, I think, is just a great example for all of us. So I really appreciate that about your work.
Thanks.
Thanks. Oh, can I ask a question?
Yes.
Okay. So I have 2 questions. So I haven't read the book yet, but I will. Okay. So I had the question about the Khadija Pharma case, right? And how this book addresses trans people of color in these very public spaces where they can be policed in an additional way, right? And you're talking about Philadelphia, and part of this, being in Philly, there are very racially segregated spaces, whether it's the neighborhood or some other parts of the city where you recognize yourself as out of place, right? And that can be for a number of reasons. So I wonder how this addresses that part of the question. And then the second part of it is, how does this address our profession, right? As political scientists who are very invested, right, in gender as a variable, right, and in thinking about and trying to think through more complicated, better ways of asking that question besides are you a male or a female, right? How do you even, push the discipline to think more complicated ways about this, like you said, this nuanced kind of question that you're really sort of presenting some complications to in ways that we don't, right? We treat gender as a variable, right? So it's either you are or you aren't, and we recognize that there can be multiple ways that people can think about who they are and how they want to exist in the world, and that can change over a life course, just like partisanship or some other kinds of identities that people can have, but our discipline hasn't quite moved in that way. And it's not just with gender, it's with race, it's with other kinds of ways that people may choose to identify themselves. So those are my
Absolutely. So Niambi is a fellow political scientist, outing me as a political scientist, trying to run from that label for a long time. But your question, I'll just take the second one first, because this is relevant to any kind of like survey, so anytime and you think about all the times when you're asked to check a box, even for marketing purposes, you get this question. And a lot of times you're not given an explanation of why you're being asked. You can sort of guess, and maybe you're angry about it for a moment or whatever, but maybe you just check a box or whatever. So I think understanding that gender is also a mutable characteristic that can change over the course of one's lifetime, and that is not currently, at least, the majority experience, but it is an experience. And so if I'm conducting a survey, then I have to think about what I'm the kind of information that I'm trying to collect. And so I talk about the census, for example. I think that the census is could be a useful survey instrument for asking people if they gave some guidance about that question about gender. So why are you asking? Is it about your current gender identity? Is it about, why does the government want this information? Is it because they want to sex-based affirmative action, that they want to remediate historical disadvantage? That would change my answer on that form. The same thing with race. So we have these racial categories in the census now, just like adding more and more as we go along with no explanation. Nobody understands how the federal government uses this information really. And there's no explanation about, are we having a genetic, is it how other people see you racially, or is it how you self-identify? I do this exercise with my students all the time when I teach courses about identity, and they really get wrapped up in, I want to be able to say, exactly who I am on the census. And I'm like, okay, but then what's the purpose of that? Like, if there's a political meaning about that, then we need to take that into consideration. So that, and just quickly about the intersectional racial dimension that you're talking about, and also class. So yes, and it goes right back to Charlene's situation. Most of the people who depend on public transportation in Philly are Black and Latino. I use my own story, so I am biracial, half Black, half white. I have class privilege where I took the subway up to Temple, actually, but I only did it 3 times a week because we only work part-time, right? but so I could avoid getting the monthly pass, but Charlene couldn't. So that's a difference there that is not racially coded explicitly, but it definitely is in terms of what's implied and in the class dimension too. So yeah, so thank you for that. Yes?
What do you think of the idea that trans kids should wait to transition medically and or socially?
Mm-hmm. Thank you for that question. Yeah, and that's something that I don't talk about in the book, but it's a great question. And I'm curious about your thoughts about this too. It's complicated. I don't know if other people, but I have been watching I Am Jazz. I think that's a really good reality show. This, for people who don't know, this is a show that documents a transgender girl who's now a teenager. Her whole story. She transitioned very early on, and so has had, and that's also interesting for this discussion about sort of the number of years of experience as female identified that you've had. That's going to change a lot with this new generation applying to a women's college. How relevant is transition if you've been living as a girl, for basically your entire life, which is Jazz's situation. on the show right now, they're talking, so Jazz has been on hormone puberty blockers. So that's something that can be done for trans kids to allow them to not go through puberty at the regular age and then make a decision later on. So now she's, I think, 17 and confronted, making this decision about surgeries and so on. So it gets you into a whole other dimension. I don't know. Any thoughts about this, Shannon?
Yeah, I mean, yes. I have a lot of thoughts, but I'm so glad you asked that question. It's nothing really could be more important, and I think it's so great that we're living in a time now where parents and medical providers and schools and so forth are recognizing just how important it is to support and affirm transgender young people in their identity, which no one can know but you. So, whatever a young person or any person says is their identity, that's something we all really need to affirm and respect, very much so. And there's no reason in the world not to do that, and schools should do that, and families and communities should do that. The question about, because you were asking also about the medical part, I mean, the ability to just be who you are and have other people respect who you are, that of course doesn't involve any kind of medical dimension to it. But some young people, like Jazz is one, want to not go through puberty in their birth sex and don't want to get the secondary sex characteristics that they really don't want, that's going to make them even more feel more uncomfortable and unhappy. And so I think it's great that that's available to young people. That's obviously a very serious decision, and it's a serious medical treatment. And so that's something that that young person would need to have a lot of serious talks with medical professionals, and along with their parents and family members, of course, and make that decision. Is that the right thing for that young person? And I don't think we should underestimate the seriousness of that. And it's, that's where we really do need competent doctors to explain things to people, so what does it mean to do this. But that sure is helping a lot of young people avoid a lot of distress that they would otherwise be going through. Yeah, it's pretty amazing that this is the first generation ever, I guess, in all of human history that we know of, where these kinds of treatments are available to people at a young age. Yeah.
And you mentioned having supportive families too, and so that's not something that everybody has, unfortunately. So there's a lot of inequity, with that issue. But I like very much what you said. Yeah.
Hi. So you spent a lot of time here talking about the binary nonetheless, and while there's a spectrum there, and you had, I'm sorry. Okay. Okay, so you spent a lot of time talking about the binary and the either or, but here in DC, really, as of a couple of weeks ago, it really is a tertiary choice now. Yeah. That it's not just male, female, and you can be on a spectrum. There is a third gender marker that you can put on, a gender neutral marker, and I don't even know what you would call that necessary, because can you say someone who is at the same time gender nonconforming female, gender nonconforming male, because they don't really identify with either, are they gender nonconforming? Well, they're conforming to whatever that third gender is. Thoughts? I mean, I don't have necessarily a question on that per se, but I just want to point that we really are moving beyond the binary, the gender binary at this point.
Yeah, thank you for bringing that up, and we wanted to get to that issue for sure. So yes, in DC, so Oregon, and in Oregon and also DC, you can have an M or an F or an X. So the X stands for unspecified. So those are options. And California has similar legislation that is proposing, and to take things even further and to have an X be an option on a birth certificate, which is interesting to think about as well. I applaud these measures insofar as they're getting us to to question the binary. But then we were talking about this earlier. I think as long as you keep anytime you have categories, then there's like inclusion and exclusion, and how do you administrate these things? And those are, I was reading about DC's changes, and it'll be interesting. They're talking about, well, we're educating TSA people and we're educating, but it'll be interesting to see how those markers are administrated on the ground by different people in different venues. I think it still introduces the very thing that I find most problematic, which is transferring any kind of authority to a complete stranger who has the power to exclude you from a bus, from a restaurant, from a public bathroom that you need to be in the public sphere in the first place. So I think it doesn't deconstruct that, and I find that problematic. I think, but it is progressive in the sense that it recognizes that non-binary gender is an identity, and people define that differently. So it's sort of it's a category again, just like trans, that seems to be unified and unitary, but then we really start talking about, like, we have so many different experiences and identities under that umbrella. So, yes.
Hi, y'all. Thank you very much for doing this today. So I'd like you to talk a little bit about sports, because since you said you deal with it in the book, and pardon my prefatory remarks, but there's kind of two things I want to think that are true about sports, and that is that everyone can participate, and that ultimately, like, it's basically for the purpose of, like, leadership and teamwork and cooperation and learning those kinds of skills. But we also know that that's not true, right? That biology does play a role in it. I mean, like, I was never going to play professional basketball. I'm 5'8", slow, and when shooting under pressure, I have a tendency to miss the backboard. But we also know that, like, the cases of Mac Beggs and Caster Semenya, if I'm saying her name correctly, in which their achievement in their respective sports were cast into doubt because you thought, does this person really qualify to be participating in this class or division, which on the basis of gender, because of gender status, because of exceptionally high, standard deviations of testosterone that were high above the norm? How do you try to kind of create those divides to the extent that you think there need to be any?
Yeah. So that it's the toughest case study. I'm writing an op-ed piece right now where I'm just at least the thought experiment of thinking about hormone ranges instead of sex segregation, because when you look at what the International Olympic Committee and NCAA has been doing in elite competition, it's all now about testosterone. So the IOC had sex testing measures which were horrendous, and I go through them in the book, where everything from, like, making anybody who wanted to compete as female had to sometimes have a gynecological exam, parade naked, this nude parade, go through all sorts of humiliating questioning and inspection, literal, like, physical inspection. Didn't apply to the male category at all, so this was just an asymmetrical thing. But now, so technically they don't have sex testing, but now it's about the level of functional testosterone that you have in your bloodstream. And so this has really impacted certain intersex athletes like Caster Semenya, and I'm forgetting, there's an Indian sprinter also, but I'm forgetting her name right now. But so people, both of them identify as women, but have an intersex condition where their bodies produce a lot more testosterone than average females. So if you look at the different, like, and I'm not a scientist, so I'm getting into some some whatever terrain here where I might mess up, but what I've seen in my research is that a lot of, like, the intersex athletes like Caster Semenya may fall into, their testosterone ranges are sort of in between the average, where it begins for men and where it ends for most women. So so they're in a kind of this in-between category, and how to administrate that. I think if it is about functional testosterone, then maybe that's what we should call the categories, and just because that's really what we're talking about at this point. And then maybe you let doctors and scientists figure out the ranges. I'm certainly not going to speculate there. But then I just want to go back to one other thing that you brought up in the beginning, because elite competition is one thing where you're just, the gold medal is everything, or being an NBA star, it's a lot of money, everything. But there are also other goals that we have in sports, especially at the recreational levels, especially with kids and schools. And I still believe in the student athlete. I'm at a school that has, a really Division I basketball team and football. So those are big things. But I do think that there are other values, and then we need to think about those. So if it's just about who wins, who's fastest, who's strongest, then it's about your capacity and it's based on testosterone. But if it's about other things, then maybe we should talk about those too.
Yeah, I'm just so glad you said that. And your chapter on this is super thoughtful and it's really good. But yeah, so that's the hardest case, the elite sports.
Yeah.
If we're not talking about elite sports, there is no reason in the world to worry 1 second about transgender kids. And it's back, speaking of Jazz, it's thanks to her. From when she was 7 years old, she challenged the U.S. Soccer Federation, I think that's the correct name. It's like the largest recreational sporting association in the world, like 15 million kids or something play. And they now have a policy, just let kids play based on their gender identity. They've had no problems whatsoever. The NCAA, even though they have their testosterone policy for the NCAA level competition, which is like the elite competition, they are very clear, like when it comes to recreational sports or high school sports, they've been really clear there should be they don't care about testosterone. So it's a really important distinction, I think.
Yeah. Thank you.
All right, this has been an amazing conversation. I wish we could keep going, but I do have to call that the last question so we can get to the book signing itself. So how about one more round of applause?